When the news first broke of an alleged hush money payment made to Stormy Daniels, Donald Trump denied knowing anything about it. His lawyers continue to mount that defense today in opening statements, saying Trump put up a wall between himself and his company, and that this is a bookkeeping issue, not a criminal matter. Prosecutors accused him of rewriting history to win an election. Joining us now, New York Times investigative reporter David Fahrenthold and Politico White House reporter and co-author of the West Wing Playbook, Eli Stokel. So, David, the defense is repeatedly making the point that this is not a hush money case. In fact, Donald Trump had a long-standing system with Cohen to fix public-facing problems like Stormy Daniels could have been. Is this case going to come down to proving what Trump knew or he says he didn't know?
Yes, I mean, that's what ties, that's why Donald Trump's on trial and not Michael Cohen. And that's why Michael Cohen's a witness and Trump's the defendant. We're going to have to prove, the prosecution's going to have to prove whether Trump knew about these payments, and not only knew about the payments to Stormy Daniels, but also knew about the cover-up, knew that this was being entered into his own books in a way that was fraudulent, described as legal retainer for Michael Cohen rather than a payment, hush money payment to a porn star. So, yes, I think that's the point of witnesses like David Pecker, who started today, and Michael Cohen, who will come later, is to connect this activity, this cover-up, back to Trump himself at the top.
And, David, I mean, Trump's attorney Blanche said Trump put up a wall between himself and his company when he became president. We may see prosecutors try to test that statement. What does the reporting at the time tell us about that?
Well, it's kind of a complex picture. So Trump theoretically gave up control of his businesses to his sons, Don Jr. and Eric, when he entered the White House. He didn't give up ownership of his business. And the wall, so he was not running the Trump organization as actively as he had while he was in the White House, but he still talked to his sons about the business. He still seems to have been consulted on decisions about the business. And in this case, allegedly, was intimately involved in one specific transaction, this, how to pay Michael Cohen, pay Stormy Daniels through Michael Cohen, and then cover it up. So I don't think that their argument that there was this ironclad wall between Trump and his business during the presidency holds up. Certainly wasn't true in a legal sense, and in a practical sense, too. It doesn't seem that there was really any time when the information about the business was kept from him.
And Eli, how does reporting square with what we've heard from Trump, what we've learned from Cohen, for example, and the story the prosecution and the defense laid out today? They were different stories.
Well, if you're talking about how this relates back to the election, what we know and we knew at the time was that this happened in the context of a very close race with a month or so to go until Election Day, and polls starting to show the race moving away from Trump after the first debate with Hillary Clinton. And so you can really see in the way the campaign reacted to it that, this was something that they were concerned about. People very close to Trump thought the race was over, thought he was going to have to drop out. Or sort of politely urged him to drop out. Reince Priebus, the RNC chair, said basically, look, you're going to lose by a landslide, or you could drop out. Trump was forced to go on tape and admit that was him on the Access Hollywood tape. It was forced. That's not something he does easily, but, he dismissed it as locker room talk, but he had to basically grapple with this. And they were very concerned that this was a big liability going forward in the election. And you saw a lot of things that took place over the following weeks. His reaction was uneven. There were more women who came forward with similar accusations of sexual harassment who he attacked from the stage at his rally. But he also tried hard to muddy the waters. He brought women who had accused former President Bill Clinton of sexual assault into the room at the second presidential debate in St. Louis, shocking everyone. But you could see this very intense effort by the campaign to sort of try to mitigate what they saw as a deep liability in the final weeks of the election.
Yeah, I mean, and this was literally the final weeks of the election. Some of these conversations were carried out at the end of October. Eli, Trump is clearly involved in his own defense, while his attorneys are trying to paint him as a hands-off, frugal businessman, a family man. How does that contradict the narrative of those who maybe know the former president better?
Well, I just think anybody who's spent time covering the White House that when Donald Trump was president or his organization, they can all tell you, and people who have been on the inside of those of the Trump Corporation or the Trump White House, the Trump campaign, they can tell you that not a lot happens without Donald Trump knowing about it and signing off on it first. The term audience of one is not just about people going on television to speak to President Trump, knowing he'd be watching. It's really sort of the overarching premise for his entire presidency and public life, that everybody who works for him was sort of performing for him or acting on his behalf, doing what he instructed them to do or what they thought he would want them to do. And so, whether the jurors will have all of that context, obviously, we'll watch the trial and find out. But people who have covered Trump extensively, far more extensively than I have even, they know that this is a very difficult thing to prove, that Donald Trump would have been, walled off from something like this happening, because it just goes against everything that we know about how he ran his company and how he ran the White House. And
David, just your thoughts on the importance of David Pecker. I mean, based on your reporting, how much will Pecker be able to contribute to the inner workings of the Trump campaign, certainly the Trump mindset at those just final weeks before the election?
Well, I think two things. Pecker certainly establishes for the jurors the thing they were doing with Stormy Daniels was not something they just invented then, this idea of catch and kill, that a tabloid would pay for a salacious story and then not run it in order to sort of help the guy whose secrets it was keeping. That was something that had been going on for a long time. It was an established thing. I think he'll say they've done it for Trump before. Certainly was a big part of his business model at the National Enquirer. So he'll establish that and sort of lay out for people what the MO was and the intention was, and that gives you a sense of the cover-up that was going on. The other thing that's important is that he's not Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen will be able to bring the jurors inside these discussions of the Trump organization, but he's got his own credibility problems. He went to jail for lying. And so I think in this case, to have somebody else corroborating that's not Michael Cohen builds up Cohen's credibility and helps the prosecutors point the finger at Trump, not relying on this one witness.
I think it's so important that I think not a lot of people really recognize or know just how prevalent these catch and kill things. Ooh, you lost his IFB there, David. But so, Eli, just the whole issue, for example, of catch and kill, which is not illegal. But it certainly has been prevalent in so many cases.
Sure. And I think it's a particular interest in the Trump case because it was something that he was so involved in and that the tabloids did on his behalf so often. And I think it really contributed to this sense that he had that he could get away with pretty much anything because he had for so long this notion that he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and still be fine. That came from years of going around New York, doing whatever he sort of wanted to do, and then making sure that the stories just sort of went away. The lawsuits, just went away through settlements or other things. And I think, winning the presidency ultimately after this experience, after these harrowing last few weeks for the Trump campaign, where they felt like, this was over, for him to win in spite of this, that sent him into the White House with this belief, maybe even more ingrained than before, that somehow he was impervious to consequences, that he could do what he talked about doing on the Access Hollywood tape and other things, and ultimately get off scot-free.
David Fahrenthold and Eli Stokols, thank you very much. And David, I'm so glad you're back. I know that losing this thing is really an issue, and so I appreciate you doing that as swiftly and effectively as you do. I thank you both for being with us.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.